In this video, I'll be zooming in on the risk identification part of the risk management process. So risk identification, in order to manage your risk, you have to identify the risk, of course, and it's mostly related to the knowable risk. So it's risk that you know rather than uncertain risk. Now, it's easier to identify knowable risk, so risk that you would that you would know for certain. And that's because you'd probably have experienced that risk in a previous project, or it's just common within the construction industry that you operate in, that risk it would be present for organizations. What would happen in the case of uncertain risk? Well, in that case, you'd have to use the best expectations, or the best predictions that you can come up with in order to identify these uncertain risks. The risks have to be identified to the maximum extent that is practicable. So you need to make sure that there is a risk, and the risk would eventuate and it would have an impact, and hence it's important to identify that risk, and that's what I mean by the maximum extent. The process itself, so the risk identification process, is iterative in nature. The reason for that is because there's a lot of risks that emerge at various stages of a construction project, let's say. So you got to be always ready to capture that risk, and the only way of doing that is if you have an iterative risk identification process. Now, some questions that I'll be going through in the video. The first question is when to identify risks. The response to that would be as early as possible in the project lifecycle, and the reason for that is because uncertainty is usually high early on in the project, and thus you need to maximize the time available for you to be able to deal with that risk. So when I say dealing with that risk, I mean, as- associating resources, or um, expertise of people, or of individuals that have the skills to deal with these sort of risks. But also, considering, the technical aspect that you might need to invest in. So any technology that you might need to invest in order to capture, or in order to control that risk. So if you were to do it early on, that risk identification process, it makes it easier for you to be able to manage that risk. The second question that we'll be looking at is how often do you identify the risk? Now, as I said earlier on, it's an iterative process. So you should be expected to initiate that process whenever there is a change that takes place to the overall dynamics of an organization. The frequency as well would be determined initially in the risk management plan. So remember, this is the first step in the risk management process. And that risk management plan would need to be approved, of course, by top management. So the rule of thumb, if you like, as to when that risk identification process needs to be implemented, it's usually whenever there's a change in the environment, in the organization's environment. The final point over here, the need to consider emergent risk. This is important, especially when you don't know risks for certain, when it's a new project that you're investing in, and when you don't have the experience within that project type. You would be expected to always be ready to capture risks, because they can emerge at any point in time. The sources of risks to identify: you need to ensure that the source is broad, and that way you'd cover the uncertainty. So any uncertainty that would be associated with the risk identification process. Now, to do that, to ensure a broad range of sources of risks are identified, you need to get stakeholders involved. And the reason for that is because stakeholders, they have different views. So that broad view would enable you to capture uh, all the knowable risk that these various stakeholders can come up with. This question, what to do once you have identified the risks, you of course need to describe that risk. So as soon as you identify it, you need to describe it. So you need to put it on the books so that people are aware of that risk. You have to make sure that you're not ambiguous in the description that you provide. So I'll give you an example. Let's say, for instance, you had a risk of construction workers not showing up on a particular day in the within the construction stage and within a particular construction stage. Now that risk that you've identified, you can't just label it as resources and that's it, because doing so would it's too ambiguous. You wouldn't be certain what the impact of the risk is, what type of risk it is. You need a detailed risk description. And when you have a detailed risk description, you explicitly state the uncertainty and the effect of that risk. Now, a point to note is that you need to avoid too much detail, otherwise you create additional work for yourself and for others in the organization, something that we need to avoid. And then as an example in that last point, I give you this instance where, there's a construction organization, it's involved in excavation works. You know that there is a very high likelihood of an environmental spill taking place and there is a river nearby. So the way that you would describe the risk in a non-ambiguous way is you'd say environmental spill that's likely to occur in a nearby river due to the excavation process that will take place in stage 2 of the project. So it's not, too detailed where you create, extra work that's not needed, but at the same time, it's not too ambiguous. Okay, so the sources of risks to identify, we already talked about that. What to do once you have identified the risks, that has already been covered. So that's it for in terms of an overview of the risk identification process. In the upcoming videos, we'll provide extra examples of how to implement that risk identification process in an organization.